job. We've got the strongest stock market, the best unemployment numbers, the most number of people ever working in the history of our country right now, almost 160 million. Our military has been rebuilt and getting even stronger. We've done a great job, and we've done it under this terrible, phony cloud, a phony cloud. That's all it was. And they should be ashamed of themselves, absolutely ashamed. And you know who knew it was a phony cloud more than anyone else? It was Schiff and Nadler and Schumer and Pelosi, every one of them. They all knew it was phony stuff. And you look at the polls are showing it maybe more than anybody else or anything else. And I've had my best polls, and I don't say why, but people see what's gone on in our country with this whole thing. I've been going through it for 3 years. For 3 years, all nonsense. So this was a very big day for our country. This was a very big day for the Republican Party. And you could say it was a great day for me, but I don't even like to say that. It's great. I'll tell you what, I very much appreciate those incredible warriors that you watched today on television, Republicans, that defended something and defended something very powerful, very important, because they were really defending our country. More than anything else, they were defending our country. But they were warriors, and they've been warriors for a long time. And everybody knew it was a hoax, especially the Democrats. I wish we could be a fly on the wall in those rooms where the Democrats would go in and talk before and after meetings. And they'd be laughing and smiling and say, can you believe that we're getting away with this? But in the end, they didn't get away with it. Yeah. So there is no such a thing. He didn't have the right to exonerate. And, you know, it's very interesting. People mention exoneration. That was something where he totally folded because he never had the right to exonerate. And it was covered very well by Congressman Turner and put to a conclusion. We were, if you take a look at not only the report, beyond the report, take a look at not what he said, but what he was forced to say. And even your networks and your network and your network and every one of these networks, they put up their hands. You know, we had a couple of cases actually we had about 6 cases where they asked our people, our representatives, television networks, please don't come in tonight. We're not going to be doing much on it. And the reason they're not, because it's over. Go ahead.
Are you concerned you could be indicted out of office? You were talking so much about WikiLeaks, and Robert Mueller called that problematic.
So WikiLeaks is a hoax just like everything else. And all of those problems having to do with crime were the biggest hoax of all. It was a witch hunt, a total witch hunt. And when you saw Robert Mueller's statement, the earlier statement, and then he did a recap, he did a correction later on in the afternoon. And you know what that correction was? And you still ask the question. You know why? Because you're fake news. And you're one of the most. And let me just tell you, the fact that you even asked that question, you're fake news. Because you know what? He totally corrected himself in the afternoon, and you know that just as well as anybody. Caitlin. I don't know whose answers weren't. I guess his answers weren't, because if you look, the whole report, you take a look at what they did. Some of the things that he didn't even know about. Some of the things he didn't even know what was going on. But, you know, in the end, what he did, he actually probably came through for himself. The performance was obviously not very good. He had a lot of problems. But what he showed more than anything else is that this whole thing has been 3 years of embarrassment and waste of time for our country. And you know what? The Democrats thought they could win an election like this. I think they hurt themselves very badly for 2020. Did I what?
Did your son Donald Trump Jr. speak with Robert
I don't know. I really don't know. I never don't know. Yeah, go ahead. I mean, frankly, whether or not he did, it wouldn't matter to me because he did nothing wrong. He did nothing wrong because it's so unimportant. It was always a very unimportant meeting. It was only important to the fake news. Go ahead. No, he didn't say that. Again, you're fake news, and you're right at the top of the list also. Let me just tell you, go back to what, it's not what he said. Read his correction. Read his correction. If you read his correction, you'll find out. That's why people don't deal with you, because you're not an honest reporter. John? John, they are devastated. The Democrats lost so big today. Their party is in shambles right now. They've got the squad leading their party. They are a mess. Where even you take a look at Scribe and you take a look at so many of the people that were the most outspoken, and they say this was a devastating day for the Democrats. And you know it, John, and everybody else knows it. This was a devastating day for the Democrats. A very dumb and very unfair question. Because if you look at his correction, he took that totally out of play. He made his decision based on the facts, not based on some rule. So you shouldn't even ask that question because you know it's a phony. Go ahead. The Democrats had nothing, and now they have less than nothing. And I think they're going to lose the 2020 election very big, including congressional seats, because of the path that they chose. Now, who knows where it goes? From what I hear, they're giving up. But I just say, I know them too well. They'll never give up. They'll go back into the room and they'll try and figure something out. This whole thing has been, honestly, it's been collusion. It's been collusion with the media. It's been collusion with other countries. This has been a disaster for the Democrats, and I think we're going to win bigger than ever. Now, I'm going to West Virginia, one of the great states, a state that's doing, if you look at percentage up, I think it's number 1 or number 2 in the country, and nobody would have believed that. West Virginia is doing great. So I'm going to West Virginia. We did have a big case today. You know, we won the asylum case in Washington, which, frankly, you should be asking about that because that's the real deal. I can't believe how nice you are today. Go ahead, give me a question.
My question, Mr. President, is that even though he backed away from it, you actually resolved the good faith indictment for him?
No, because we did nothing wrong. The answer is very simple. Nothing was done wrong. This was all a big hoax. And if you look at it today, nothing was done wrong. Now, I believe what you're going to find a lot of things that were done very wrong, but that's going on now. That's something you haven't been writing about, and that has to do with the other side. That has to do with a thing called investigate the investigators. Let's see what happens. That's going to be very interesting.
Robert Mueller did a good job. Where are you at on that?
Look, I think Robert Mueller did a horrible job, both today and with respect to the investigation. But in all fairness to Robert Mueller, he had nothing to work with. You know, you can be a builder, but if they don't give you the right materials, you're not going to build a very good building. Robert Mueller had no material. He had nothing to work with. So obviously he did very poorly today. I don't think there's anybody, even among the fakers, I don't think there's anybody that would say he did well. I looked at your people. They're saying it was devastating for the Democrats. And even, I will tell you, the two most nauseous and nauseating networks whose ratings have both gone down, way down, even they said this was a really bad day for the Democrats. So Robert Mueller did a poor job, but in all fairness to him, he had nothing to work with, David.
Do you regret not talking to Mueller now that you've seen him in action?
Look, I saw what he did to people, how he ruined people's lives because they didn't remember a date or something very minor. He ruined people's lives. The Democrats, they took people and they destroyed their lives. They went bankrupt because they couldn't afford the legal fees, and they were good people, many, many people. So when you ask me that question, all they have to do is see how nice this weather is. If I made a mistake and said I was talking to the media and it was a little bit rainy, a little bit overcast, they'd say, well, we have to do, he lied. Let me tell you, I've seen what they've done to people. I've seen how they've destroyed people like General Flynn and so many others. What they've done to people, no, I did the right thing. Well, Mueller had no material. Sure, Mueller had no material to work with, and he did a horrible job. Obviously, his presentation was way off, but that's okay. It didn't matter. He had no material. There was nothing done wrong. In fact, things were done right. There was nothing done wrong. And certainly, I mean, look, I read the papers and I read the press and I read the Internet. And if you see what's going on the Internet, if you listen to the Internet, this was one of the worst performances in the history of our country. So you know that very well. But I don't think anybody could have done a good performance. He had no material. It was a fake set of facts that the Democrats used and others to try and do really an illegal overthrow. But we're going to find out about that. Well, the asylum is a big... Say it?
Guatemala.
So the asylum is a very big ruling. That was a tremendous ruling today. We appreciate it. We respect the courts very much. That helps us very much at the border. The numbers are way down at the border, which is a good thing. Apprehensions are way down because Mexico has now 22,000 soldiers, and they mean business because they know what happens. The alternative is not good for them. It's also good for Mexico what they're doing because the cartels have been running all of the border for years and years, and Mexico is saying, and the president is saying, we got to clean it up. So they've got 21,000 soldiers. They'll probably put up more. But this ruling today on asylum is a tremendous ruling. So Guatemala gave us their word. We were going to sign a safe third agreement, and then all of a sudden they backed up. They said it was their Supreme Court. I don't believe that, but they used their Supreme Court as the reason they didn't want to do it. So we'll either do tariffs or we'll do something. We're looking at something very severe with respect to Guatemala. I've already cut all payments. I did that a year ago. I cut all payments going to Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. We used to send them $500 million for nothing. For nothing. They didn't do anything except set up caravans. So Guatemala, we're going to take care of, and it won't even be tough. We're looking at a couple of different things. One of the things very heavy is, as you know, Mexico has put 6,000 people on that border. Let me just tell you something. I know you always have a question. You mean my White House aides lied? What about his aides? What about Mueller's aides? He didn't say that at all. You're untruthful when you ask. You are untruthful. When you ask that question, you're untruthful. And you know who else is untruthful? You know who else is untruthful? His aides. And Weissman was untruthful. And Weissman got caught just like he did with Arthur Anderson, where he lost in the Supreme Court 9-0. His aides were very untruthful. And they put Mueller... not at all. They put Mueller in a very bad position. His aides put him in a very bad position. And if you were ever truthful, you'd be able to write the truth.
Have you called Boris Johnson?
Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. You have been listening to President Trump criticize former special counsel Robert Mueller following his roughly 6 hours of testimony on Capitol Hill. Let's bring in Kim Whaley, Rebecca Roife, Ed O'Keefe, and Major Garrett. Kim is a CBS News legal analyst. Rebecca is a CBSN legal contributor and former assistant district attorney in New York County. Ed is CBS News political correspondent, and Major is CBS News Chief Washington correspondent. Major, let's begin with you. We just heard the president there. Fair to say he was happy with how Republican lawmakers handled the hearings today.
Quintessential President Trump branding. Terrible day for Democrats. Terrible day for Robert Mueller. None of the things brought forth in the course of the hearing have any validity or any rationality or any political consequences for him. That's his branding effort. That's his signal to the country. And that's his framing of what happened today. And as someone who pays a very close bit of attention to political performance, he was a sharp and unrelenting critic of the performance of Robert Mueller, not the underlying document itself, though he has lots of problems with that. And on the performance scale, I think Democrats would concede Robert Mueller, as a special counsel, did write a comprehensive report, but was not in any way, shape, or form a compelling or star witness for them to bring that report to life, which was their on-the-record description of what today's hearing was at least partially about. If Democrats wanted this to be a searing moment of great national drama where Robert Mueller would give voice, action, and passion to the report which he and his team produced, they were sorely mistaken and probably disappointed.
Ed O'Keefe, you are standing by, I know, for what we expect to be at any moment now House Speaker Nancy Pelosi appearing alongside the chairs of those two committees where those hearings were held. Any inkling as to what the message may be now?
No, we don't know, and we'll be hearing from her shortly from right here. What she decides to tell us in regards to how today went and whether she now perhaps joins her 91 colleagues who are for an impeachment inquiry or for impeachment, or at least signals that she's keeping an open mind to it and realizes that perhaps what was presented today is more urgent evidence that Congress needs to move in that direction. We'll have to just wait and see. The general vibe up here is that the afternoon went better than the morning, mostly thanks to the questions that were asked by members of the Intelligence Committee, who were far more direct and able to extract a little more information from Mueller, who seemed to spend the morning struggling to not only hear what lawmakers were asking him, but also struggled to comprehend some of the questions because they were so specific to certain aspects of the investigation. But, you know, Democrats have been clamoring for today for quite some time. And as one aide put it to me earlier, there was no smoking gun today necessarily, just affirmation of their position on things, that there is evidence that perhaps the president obstructed justice, that one day as a private citizen maybe he'll face criminal charges. But beyond that, nothing explosive and nothing nearly as compelling as Michael Cohen's testimony, James Comey's testimony, or some of the other developments in this years-long investigation into Russian interference into what the Trump campaign might have been up to.
Kim, let me ask you, based on what we heard over the course of those 6 hours from Director Mueller, was anything revealed that was perhaps not known before today regarding either obstruction of justice or Russian interference?
I think that some things were clarified. I don't think really the story today is how Robert Mueller performed, but rather what's actually in the report, what the evidence showed. And he did clarify and reiterate what's in the report, in which, unfortunately, Attorney General Barr distorted, and that is that when he said he was not exonerated, there is evidence of obstruction of justice. There's evidence of conspiracy, that you do not need to prove that he dismiss Robert Mueller in order to show obstruction of justice. And with respect to both conspiracy and obstruction of justice, in particular with obstruction of justice, when the Democrats walked through the legal elements, it's like a recipe. You have to show a number of things. When they walked through those things with respect to each piece of evidence, the Republicans did not respond to the evidence. They didn't try to undermine the substantive claim there, the facts, essentially. This isn't a point of view. These are facts. But this doesn't really amount to a whole lot if nothing will come of it, if Congress is not going to impeach. Listen, we had the report. We had Michael Cohen's blockbuster supposedly testimony. We have this, and we have a president who gets on the bully pulpit and is covered in his basically denying the reality, and that becomes the narrative. And unfortunately, we're moving towards a government, a presidency after this that is unaccountable. It's not going to be Donald Trump forever, but the next person who comes into office will be in a position to violate norms, potentially commit crimes, and have it be a big shrug. And that's a problem for democracy for the years forward, not just with respect to this moment.
Rebecca, I want to ask you about something we heard the president say over and over just a few moments ago, this notion that Mueller corrected some of his testimony, which he did. He issued a correction to his morning testimony. This was in his opening statement in the afternoon before the House Intelligence Committee. Let's first listen to what Bob Mueller told Congressman Ted Lieu and then his correction.
So to recap what we've heard, we have heard today that the president ordered former White House counsel Don McGahn to fire you. The president ordered Don McGahn to then cover that up and create a false paper trail. And now we've heard the president ordered Corey Lewandowski to tell Jeff Sessions to limit your investigation so that you stop investigating the president. I believe a reasonable person looking at these facts could conclude that all three elements of the crime of obstruction of justice have been met. And I'd like to ask you, the reason, again, that you did not indict Donald Trump is because of OLC opinion stating that you cannot indict a sitting president, correct?
That is correct. Now, before we go to questions, I want to add one correction to my testimony this morning. I want to go back to one thing that was said this morning by Mr. Lieu, who said, and I quote, "You didn't charge the president because of the OLC opinion." That is not the correct way to say it. As we say in the report, and as I said at the opening, we did not reach a determination as to whether the president committed a crime.
All right, so OLC, Office of Legal Counsel within the Department of Justice. Rebecca, remind us what this OLC opinion actually was, and why did Bob Mueller, you think, feel the need to make that correction?
Right. So the opinion says that you can't indict a sitting president, and that's important to him because to say that somebody has committed a crime when that person cannot then go into court and defend themselves is problematic from the perspective of prosecutorial tradition. So he would never do that. I think the nuance that he was correcting was that he did say in the report, we just never reached that question. And so in his initial answers, it sounded like that's the only reason. Mm-hmm. We definitely would have charged him if it weren't for that. And he doesn't want to say that for obvious reasons, because if you're going to make a determination not to charge somebody, you can't then say, oh, but by the way, he really committed a crime, because otherwise you've undermined the purpose of that initial decision not to charge.
So there was also an interesting moment. Congressman Sean Maloney of New York asked Bob Mueller why he did not subpoena the president for a sit-down interview. Let's listen to some of that.
Did you have sufficient evidence of the president's intent to obstruct justice, and is that why you didn't do the interview?
There's a balance. In other words, how much evidence you have to satisfy the last element against how much time are you willing to spend in the courts litigating the interview with the president.
And in this case, you felt that you had enough evidence of the president's intent.
We had to make a balanced decision in terms of how much evidence we had compared to the length of time it would take.
And sir, because I have limited time, you thought that if you gave it to the Attorney General or to this Congress, that there was sufficient evidence that it was better than that delay.
Can you state that again?
Well, that it was better than the delay to present the sufficient evidence, your term, of the president's intent to obstruct justice to the Attorney General and to this committee. Isn't that why you didn't do the interview?
No, the reason we didn't do the interview is because of the length of time that it would take to resolve the issues attendant to that.
Kim, what do you make of the special counsel's reasoning to not subpoena President Trump for a face-to-face interview, that it was about not wanting to drag out the Russia probe?
Well, I mean, we're focused on what Mr. Mueller himself believed was sufficient to obstruct justice, but all the evidence, as I suggested before, is there. It's all in the report. People, specifically Congress, can make their own determination, and that's essentially, I think, what he was referring to. The next step, he was alluding to in other places, the next step would be a possible impeachment. But I think that exchange there was essentially him saying, listen, originally we believed, and it's in the report, that an interview of Mr. Trump was, quote, vital, but eventually it became not so vital because we accumulated additional information of intent to obstruct justice. And at some point, we put the evidence of intent to obstruct justice on one side of the scale, and we put the delay, the problems of delay, if we do subpoena him, on the other side of the scale, and just decided the delay wasn't worth it. We've done enough. He didn't go so far as to say there's sufficient evidence to charge obstruction of justice. As was mentioned, that he was very clear he didn't want to do that. That was a decision made a long time ago. But he did essentially say if we had subpoenaed him, it would have taken additional months. That would have dragged the whole investigation out. And we decided we had enough for the next step, those are my words, essentially to hand it off to the political process, which by virtue of the OLC memo, by virtue of the memo, the internal memo, policy memo saying you can't indict a president, is the only way structurally to hold any president of the United States potentially accountable for wrongdoing. If the Congress can't do it, then we have an unaccountable office of the presidency, not just Trump. That's the issue here.
All right, a reminder, we are waiting at any moment for House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to appear there in the room where Ed is standing by for her reaction after these Mueller hearings. Major, let me ask you, the Trump campaign put out a statement this afternoon saying in part that, quote, these hearings were a disaster for Democrats, and Robert Mueller confirmed what we already knew, no collusion, no obstruction, and the way President Trump has been treated is unprecedented. How much do you expect to hear the Trump campaign talk about Robert Mueller now that these hearings are over?
Well, the Trump campaign will use what was established today, at least in part, to buttress their case. No evidence of a conspiracy that was worth charging in a criminal court, and no decision on obstruction of justice. For them, they will shorten that. No collusion, no obstruction, game over, set and match to President Trump. What was curious, though, Elaine, and whatever the campaign says will be to benefit the re-election prospects of the president. We know that that's a given. What re-election campaigns say in a fevered political moment is to be predicted. It will always be to the benefit, it hopes, of the candidate. But what was interesting to me today is as Democrats asked all the questions about conduct that certainly looked and sounded obstructive, if not might have been in terms of the sharp letter of the law, or on questions about contacts with the Trump campaign and Russians, lies about those contacts to cover them up. Those are all very serious issues, and they speak to this question of what is the new normal in American politics. Are any of these behaviors acceptable in American politics at the highest levels, which is, of course, the President of the United States? At no point did Republicans, given all the opportunities to cross-examine or poke holes in those assertions, either on obstructive behavior or contacts with Russians that, though might not have been criminal, certainly do not represent any kind of normal conduct we've ever seen before, and then lying about those conducts to cover them up and contacts, is that acceptable? They never mounted a case that they weren't acceptable or that those assertions were invalid. They essentially let them go into the record unchallenged. What does that tell you? As political actors, Republicans didn't try to mount a defense about obstructive behavior or contacts with the Russians. All they said was, the president's not criminally liable. Essentially asserting on behalf of the Republican Party under Donald Trump, that's the new standard. Not proper, not historic, not norms that we've all accepted across party lines over more than 2 centuries. It's just not criminal. If that's the standard they're willing to live with, then that's a standard the Republican Party actually, in this era and going forward, will have to live with.
Rebecca, I want you to weigh in with your legal ear and respond to what we just heard Major spell out there, and the fact that Republicans did not attempt to dispute the arguments that the Democrats were making, what is contained within the report itself, these instances of obstruction.
Right. So, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And prosecutors often say amongst ourselves, when prosecutors have a really good case, defense attorneys tend to distract. They tend to point out, oh, there's something corrupt about this government, corrupt about this investigation. They try to make the jury look somewhere else other than the evidence. It can be very successful. But that's, I think, what this tactic was. Rather than to say, no, this isn't true, they never did that. And so, I don't know, in a normal jury, usually as a prosecutor, you win. If you've got the facts and they're distracting, you're like, I've got them running. So then you're fine. But
nowhere did we ever hear Republicans attempt to challenge those facts.
Exactly. And that's the point. It's like, if you win on the facts and you're a prosecutor in a normal courtroom, you get a conviction. Because at the end, you get a chance to say, guys, all it matters is these facts. It doesn't matter. This other stuff is distraction. But here, we were in a political discourse. And, it's a pretty good distraction. I think they did a pretty good job of, these talking points that made people think, what? This was a witch hunt, and so much money was spent, and it was
questioning
so long.
The motives of the
and
investigators.
Questioning the motives of the investigators, and echoing President Trump's witch hunt sort of story and the Steele dossier and all of that. It is not unsuccessful, because you don't have a judge up there saying, guys, this doesn't, this don't pay attention to this. That doesn't matter. What matters is the facts here. So, I don't know. I say the Democrats win on the facts. The Republicans may win on the rhetoric. And in the end, because this is a political drama, I would say the rhetoric is more important than the facts, or may be more important when it comes down to it.
Right. Very different criteria when judging this in the court of public opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Ed, so you are awaiting House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and those Democratic chairmen. Where does all of this actually leave members of Congress now as they try to continue their own investigations, knowing what we saw take place today and how Republicans are characterizing it, how the president himself is characterizing it, and what you're hearing from Democrats at this moment?
Well, I think they're waiting to get some signals from the three that will speak with us shortly. We're told they're coming closer to the bottom of the hour. But, we've asked Democrats today coming out of that hearing, what next? What happens next? You heard Chairman Schiff at the end of his hearing outline all the different lines of inquiry that Democrats are pursuing in terms of the president's finances and other potential ties to foreign entities and other questions about the administration itself. And those investigations continue. And that's been one of the messages from Speaker Pelosi over the last several months, whenever she's confronted with some sense of impatience from fellow Democrats or gets asked about her own opinion on impeachment, that there is a methodical process underway in several different committees, and it will continue. The question is, when they go home at the end of this week to begin their summer recess, do they hear from constituents at all about whether or not they should continue this or drop it? And it'll depend, I think, on what corner of the country they go back to. The most Democratic districts, of course, there will be concern that this is being slow-walked. In those swing districts that Democrats won last year, they're probably going to hear more from constituents asking whatever happened in all that legislation you were going to do on health care and education and the economy. What's up with that? And so, what will be interesting here is whether the Speaker herself signals her own views on what happened today, and whether she's any closer to perhaps realizing that this is inevitable, or if she continues to throw caution to the wind and insist that this will be a slow, methodical process that continues into the fall.
Right, because I guess for some folks, the central question remains now, is the Democratic Party any closer, or are they further away now from the prospect of either opening an impeachment inquiry or pursuing impeachment itself?
Right. And as Mueller was testifying here in Washington today, you had 8 presidential candidates at an NAACP forum in Detroit basically underscoring their support to continue this process of investigating and possibly getting to impeachment. Among others, Joe Biden saying it has to be methodical. Cory Booker reinforcing his views that impeachment should be underway already. Kirsten Gillibrand, Elizabeth Warren, among those saying this, and they'll continue to say it. And in the absence of Congress being in session during the month of August, if they're the Democrats out there continuing to push for this, then it may put pressure on lawmakers when they get back. But they, like other Democrats, know that impeachment's only one issue they should and will talk about, because there is more concern. If you look at our polling, if you look at opinions of most Americans, they're not for impeachment, and some polling says, look, the Mueller report's over. It's time to move on.
Major, I wonder, from your conversations with Trump campaign officials, do they see a political benefit to just this specter of impeachment the longer that it continues to sort of hang over this political landscape?
I don't know if they would say it's a political benefit. When I asked Brad Parscale, the campaign manager, if he was hoping that Democrats would go toward impeachment, he said, no, that's a terrible thing. It's not good for the country. I don't want them to do this. I think the Trump campaign and those around the president are much happier with the sense of paralysis that Democrats have about this question. I think that they look at that and say, when the president says the Democrats are in disarray, the Democrats are a disaster, the Democrats can't do anything, he is in part identifying this existential question for Democrats. What do we do in this moment? And it's essentially been the question that has wrapped itself around the Mueller report since it became a public document. What do you do? When Robert Mueller gave his very short statement at the end of May, he said there is a constitutional process by which to handle this information. That was as clear a signal as he could ever give that the constitutional process is one that is invested in the House of Representatives, and it is an impeachment inquiry. He would not talk about impeachment today. He wouldn't even speak the word, because he is, again, just trying to say, I'm the investigator. I've assembled this body of evidence. It is your responsibility, House of Representatives, which happens to be under Democratic control, to decide what to do with it or not do with it. And that question has never really escaped House Democrats since the report became a public document. What has escaped them is a resolution to that question. What will you do? Now, those presidential candidates that Ed O'Keefe mentioned, especially Elizabeth Warren, believe that the result is not the point, whether or not he is impeached and whether the Senate tries and convicts. That's not the point. Her point is, ask the question. Have everyone take a vote on whether this behavior is or is not consistent with the historical definition of high crimes and misdemeanors. And that process itself will clarify not only in this period of time, but for all time, or at least for the foreseeable future, if this conduct does or does not reach that standard. That's a question Elizabeth Warren and an increasing number of Democrats seeking the party's nomination at least want to have asked and answered in public. That's why they support an impeachment inquiry. Not necessarily to convict the president, but to put the question squarely before everyone involved in this process.
Kim, let me turn to you. I want to ask you about an exchange that the president had as he was leaving there on the South Lawn with our Paula Reed, our CBS News White House correspondent. Paula asked the president, she said, Mueller said that you could be charged once you leave office. The president said, no, he didn't say that. He went on to call Paula fake news, in essence, said that that is not what Mueller said. Can you clarify for us what it is that we actually heard Bob Mueller say? Before you react, I'm told that we do have that sound. Let's go ahead and play that.
No, he didn't say that. Again, you're fake news, and you're right at the top of the list also. Let me just tell you, go back to what, it's not what he said. Read his correction. Read his correction. If you read his correction, you'll find out. That's why people don't deal with you, because you're not an honest reporter.
All right. We should note, of course, we just talked about that correction a moment ago, and it did not have to do with the question that Paula asked. But can you clarify for us, Kim, what is it that Robert Mueller said on the point that Paula asked about, that the president could be charged once he leaves office?
My recollection is it was an unequivocal yes, but of course the record will speak for itself on that. But I can also say, as a lawyer, having read the OLC opinion as well as the opinions prior to it, both in the Clinton administration, Nixon administration, the independent counsels who disagreed with that outcome, that the current OLC opinion certainly does not say that a president as a private citizen could not be charged with crimes committed in office. The question there comes down to a statute of limitations. Certain crimes have basically end dates. That is, can't charge them after that. The general federal one is 5 years. So if Mr. Trump gets a second term in office, 8 years, then a Democratic, presumably, administration would not be able potentially to bring those charges. But if he's out of office in 4 years, those prosecutors could take that 448-page book and all the underlying evidence, bring it to a grand jury, and the grand jury could make make a determination as to whether to indict Mr. Trump as a private citizen. But I think another really important thing that came out of the day that was mentioned earlier in terms of other substantive legislation that voters should care about, it was a rare moment of bipartisanship. Republicans asking Mr. Mueller, should we be worried about Russians' attacks on our electoral process? He said, absolutely. Every American should worry about that. Other countries that don't like us are learning from the Russians' antics and maneuvers. And he said immediately this Congress should take up legislation to, at a minimum, require the various intelligence agencies to share information so that they can figure out how to keep our electoral process safe. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, what the ships on the Titanic are doing, that is the politicians, if the ship itself goes down. Our entire democracy hinges on the notion that when we go to the ballot booth, it counts. We cast our own point of view, our own view on who should be president, who should be Congress. And where we are careening is to a situation where that is not what is happening. And so I hope one thing that's taken out of this is a bipartisan effort to protect all Americans' right to vote. Republicans, Democrats, independents, that I think was a bright light in the second half of the day that was bipartisan, both sides of the aisle. And it's unfortunate Mr. Trump is calling the whole thing a hoax, because it's not. That's quite serious, and something Mr. Mueller correctly said we should all be concerned about.
Ed, to follow up on Kim's point, I believe it was Congressman Will Hurd, a Republican from Texas, who was expressing a great deal of concern about interference in the 2020 election. I'm wondering what it is in conversations that you've had with lawmakers, given the fact that there is a lot constantly taking place with various investigations and other matters. But this question of securing the 2020 election, is that something that you've heard a lot from lawmakers about?
Oh, yeah, because there are several different proposals to bolster election security that are sitting dormant, mostly over on the Senate side. There have been a few that have come out of the House. Republicans, so far at least, as part of their sort of blanket decision not to really take up significant legislation but focus only on confirmations, have continued to ignore not only Democratic proposals but bipartisan proposals that are sitting there waiting to address some of the concerns about potential interference from foreign actors and to provide more resources to municipalities as they prepare for next year's election. So it's absolutely a top-of-mind concern. It's one of the issues that Pelosi has told her caucus to talk about over the course of the next few weeks, is that Democrats have tried to advance legislation that would bolster election security, and it's being blocked by Republicans over in the Senate. So it's definitely a concern. And, Mueller was making the point today that this is something the country should focus on. Members of both parties hear that. Hurd, as you mentioned, is definitely one of them. Other Democrats as well. But it's just not moving. And partly because there's some concern or some uncertainty about whether the president himself would even support any of that kind of legislation, because potentially to do so would be to concede something that he hasn't entirely conceded regarding foreign interference in the 2016 elections.
Rebecca, let me ask you, this idea of interference in the 2020 election, you heard Ed talk about various efforts here. In the meantime, people within those agencies are still tasked with trying to pursue and investigate what could be taking place in the run-up to November of next year. Can you give us a sense of what the atmosphere might be like? Does this kind of political discourse that's taking place now, and the questioning of people like Robert Mueller, the questioning of the motives of Justice Department officials, that being very public, does that have an effect on current investigators, do you think?
I actually think it doesn't. I think most of these people are career officials, and they see their job as, you and I, so we come into work, we do our thing, and I think that this is an important thing. And as Robert Mueller said, part of what he did in this hearing, and part of when he becomes animated, is he's like, leave me out of the political fray. But when you start talking about attacking our institutions, I'm going to jump in there and I'm going to try to make you listen. That this is a very serious assault, and if this is the new normal, if our concern is the new normal is is you can welcome these assaults, you can encourage these assaults, then we're in trouble and we have to stop that. And so I think people hear that. Career civil servants are listening to that, if anything, and are going to continue to do that, having a new sense of the importance of protecting America when the political process doesn't seem to be working particularly well.
Does this kind of spectacle, though, Rebecca, I guess is what I'm wondering, have an effect on even the most experienced career prosecutors, career Justice Department officials, career FBI investigators?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say no. I think it's impossible that it doesn't have some effect at all. I mean, even the small moment, the one thing we learned today that we didn't know was why Mueller didn't subpoena the president. And I thought that was a pretty interesting piece of information, because a normal prosecution, you would cross that T and dot that I before you end your investigation. But here, they made that balancing decision. And I think about it, I don't think he did it on purpose, but is part of the balance that there is so much pressure coming down, so much, so many allegations of corruption and this whole, and the investigation is illegitimate. The time thing. So it's the need to wrap it up quickly. And maybe that was the best thing for the American public. But part of the reason it was the best thing for the American public is because there's so much rhetoric about how illegitimate this thing is. And so he wanted to just finish, get the facts out, and get done. And to me, it's like that was a little glimpse, the first glimpse I've ever seen, that Mueller might have been slightly affected by what was, the political theater that was going on outside. So the answer to your question is yes, of course. Nobody's totally immune to that. I don't think in the end it's going to change what people do unless there's some kind of directive that comes down. I think people will just do what they're going to do. But I think it's impossible that people don't hear it.
Major, as we've been speaking, I'm wondering, have you been hearing from Trump officials either inside or outside of the White House or in the campaign about how it is, we heard the president himself just a short time ago on the South Lawn, but how it is that the president has also been reacting away from the cameras to what we heard from Robert Mueller?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think it applies particularly to the president's mistreatment of Paula Reed. She asked a straightforward question. The president belligerently attacked her with a set of facts that have nothing to do with the underlying question she asked. But let me give you an insight into how I think the president landed there. When the president was talking about the correction that Robert Mueller issued at the top of the Intelligence Committee hearing, which we've played for our audience, one of the things those in the Trump legal team, and I believe those close to the president, told him today was, see, that correction is important because it means that Robert Mueller didn't make a decision on obstruction, not because he was prevented from making a decision, but he didn't reach a conclusion. Now, one of the things that Robert Mueller didn't say, but all the Trump loyalists believe, because you can read it in the report, is that Mueller and his team did not make a determination on obstruction of justice because, and these are their words, difficult questions of fact and law. So the president looks at that. All of his legal team says, see, Mueller left that out. But that's one of the big reasons that he didn't reach a conclusion on obstruction. How does the president interpret that in his head? Well, those questions, difficult ones of fact and law, will always exist, which means I'll never be charged, which means it doesn't matter if I'm in the office or not. I won't be charged as a private citizen because I can't be, because they're difficult questions of fact and law. So the president takes that, jumps to the correction, and then says, you shouldn't even ask that because I could never be charged. I guarantee you that's exactly how Donald Trump interpreted and added those two things up, even though in the moment, Paula Reed's question was completely legitimate on the facts. The president's answer was not. But I guarantee you he went through a three-step process. Correction, difficult questions of fact and law, I won't ever be charged, there you go.
Drawing his own conclusion.
Drawing his own conclusion, and most importantly, creating a framing device about his innocence and a belligerence about the media, asking about things he finds out of bounds, even though they are completely within bounds, and trying to stretch the parameters of what is factual, what is truthful, what is sitting right in front of us, to his benefit.
I wonder, Major, just hearing you spell out that thinking, is this perhaps a line that we could be hearing in campaign rallies to come? One could envision this correction notion being a point that the president would want to emphasize over and over and over again.
I can envision it. I won't predict it. I've given up that process with this president and his rallies.
So, Ed, remind our viewers who have been hearing about this event that is supposed to take place at any moment, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who is going to be joining her there at the podium. What are you hearing about the timing of this? Because I believe this was originally supposed to take place about an hour ago. That was, of course, before the president came out on the South Lawn.
Right, and the Speaker, with all due respect, rarely is punctual when it comes to this kind of a news conference. As one of my colleagues walks through the shot, there we go. But we have not been given an official signal as to when she's showing up. She will be joined whenever she arrives, if she ever arrives, with the chairman of the Judiciary and Intelligence Committees, Jerry Nadler and Adam Schiff, who led today's deliberations and from whom she's, or with whom she's working out a lot of the party's strategy on how exactly to proceed. There was a meeting that she held a little while ago, one of her regularly scheduled weekly meetings that she held today because despite it being Wednesday, today is kind of